popular English language show on current affairs in China, running since 2010. As always, for those of you who are joining via Zoom, you can use the Q&A function to ask your questions. And if you're watching this via YouTube, please put your questions in the comment section and we will make sure that we get to them as well. But before I kick it off to Kaiser, we have the great honor of having Congresswoman Judy Chu with us today, who will give opening remarks. Representing California's 27th Congressional District, Congresswoman Chu is the first Chinese American woman elected to the U.S. Congress. She's the chair of the Congressional Asia Pacific American Caucus, which advocates for the needs and concerns of the Asian American and Pacific Islander community across the nation. Congresswoman, we're delighted to have you with us. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, and to Jewish Currents for hosting today's important discussion. The increasing atmosphere of xenophobia and prejudice due to the coronavirus crisis has created real fear and anxiety in the Asian American community. That's why it means so much to have support from so many other communities to show that we are not alone. We need a way to come together to discuss China in a way that advances U.S. interests, but not have animosity that will worsen tensions and endanger Asian Americans who become increasingly the victims of anti-Asian bigotry. There is absolutely a necessary place in our political conversation to criticize the illiberal and challenging policies implemented by the Chinese Communist Party. But as the coronavirus pandemic continues to worsen, and as members of both political parties look to place all blame for the virus, its spread, the economic consequences, and the lives lost solely at the feet of China's government, I worry that careless or inaccurate rhetoric will only fan the flames of xenophobia that continue to put Asian Americans at risk. We've already seen plenty of this. Since the start of this crisis, there's been an alarming uptick in hate crimes and incidents targeting the Asian American community due to misconceptions that Asian Americans are more likely to carry the virus and should be blamed for its spread. In fact, according to data compiled by various Asian American Pacific Islander hate crime reporting websites, there have been over 2,000 anti-Asian hate incidents and crimes reported in just the last few months alone. At its height, there were nearly 100 hate incidents being reported each day. And at the end of March, the FBI warned that because a portion of the US public will associate COVID-19 with China and Asian American populations, they expect that hate crime incidents against Asian Americans will likely surge across the United States, endangering Asian American communities. It began in January with dirty looks, insults, and misinformation about Asian-owned restaurants and businesses. But now it's escalated to spitting, yelling, and physical attacks against Asian Americans all across the United States. In New York, an Asian American woman was simply taking out her garbage when a man poured acid on her, causing her to have second-degree burns on her face and on her arms. In Texas, a man stabbed a family of 3 Asian Americans, including a 6-year-old and a 2-year-old, at a Sam's Club, saying that he wanted to kill Asian Americans. In San Francisco, an elderly Asian man was simply collecting cans when he was taunted and attacked by individuals who said that they hated Asians. And in Los Angeles, a 16-year-old boy was sent to the hospital after being attacked by bullies who accused him of having coronavirus because he's Asian. These sort of violent incidents saw a marked increase around the time that President Trump and his followers began using the word China coronavirus or Wuhan virus. Those attacks came despite guidance from the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention and the World Health Organization, urging not to associate a disease with a specific region, country, or an ethnicity due to the stigma that it causes. In fact, the CDC's coronavirus resource website explicitly warns that stigma hurts everyone, by creating more fear or anxiety toward ordinary people instead of focusing on the disease that is causing the problem. Now, in Congress, I knew that my fellow members of Congress knew that something was going on with anti-Asian incidents, but I did not think that they knew the extent of it. That is why in February, I sent a letter to every member of the House and Senate urging them to avoid stoking xenophobia by only sharing accurate information on the virus. I informed them about the extent of the crimes and have also consistently pushed back on attempts to label it the Chinese virus or Wuhan virus. But it's clear that we also need to address the way we speak about China generally, or else we risk launching a new Cold War and encouraging more xenophobia. Intentionally vague criticisms against a whole country of over 1 billion people reinforce outdated and dangerous Cold War mentalities that the entire country is an enemy. This is bolstered by unfounded claims that the virus was engineered in a Chinese lab and intentionally unleashed on the world. Spreading conspiracy theories like that have been debunked and that are without evidence has unintentionally or maybe intentionally impacted Asian Americans in the United States, who, as the FBI warned, may increasingly become targets of hate crimes. And we've already started to see an impact. According to one survey, the percentage of US voters who say China is an enemy has risen 11 percentage points to 31% since January. In World War II, this kind of fear-mongering and xenophobia ultimately led to the shameful incarceration of innocent Japanese Americans who were stripped of their civil liberties and imprisoned in desolate internment camps simply because of their ethnicity. We should not repeat the mistakes of World War II and the Cold War by fomenting fear of an entire nation again today. Additionally, attempts to make it easier to sue the country of China contribute to the idea that the entire country is deliberately responsible for all of the deaths and suffering caused by COVID-19 in the US and around the world. This is not only inaccurate, it also foments anger and blame, and it impedes our ability to work with the Chinese government in areas where our interests overlap. For instance, Americans still overwhelmingly support cooperating with China on responding to the coronavirus. This is not to say we should not criticize China, but rather do it with specificity. Speaking about the problem in specific terms helps you to be more accurate and responsible while simultaneously providing better clarity about our concerns with the Chinese Communist Party and its policies. Just expressing vague anger at the Chinese, on the other hand, assigns blame in ways that negatively impact those who are ethnically Chinese or perceived to be Chinese, even if they have nothing to do with the Chinese government. And doing that simply creates nationalist anger for political purpose, and that is a true danger. In the meanwhile, let me express my concerns for the Asian American community here in the United States. I want to urge anyone that is experiencing a hate crime or incident to report it. There are 6 hate crime reporting sites that have been developed by AAPI advocates. The one that has the most reporting right now is called Stop AAPI Hate, and you can report in several Asian languages. Now, reporting is safe, but not only that, it can help in providing resources. If it was a hate crime, then it can help you with actually connecting with law enforcement. But most importantly, it is a way of fighting against isolation, because the worst thing to feel is that you are alone when such an ugly thing happens. And let me say that it doesn't matter if it's a physical assault or if it's somebody shouting an insult to you, a racial insult. All of that should be reported. And let me say, we are trying to create on a national basis, national awareness of what's going on. There was just last week a very successful national AAPI town hall on the subject that was held by on a digital basis by NBC. And there were many, many participants. But we have to continue to do this with our friends, our neighbors, our coworkers. Let me also say that many people feel kind of helpless when they see such an incident. So I want to tell you that there are the 5 Ds of bystander intervention that have been developed on a wonderful advocacy group. But what are these 5 Ds? If you see an ugly anti-AAPI hate crime or incident, you can distract, delegate, document, direct, or delay, or all 5 of them. Distract, how about just throwing your keys down and stopping a verbal assault from happening? Delegate, that is finding an authority figure who can take care of it. Document, use your iPhone to document it. Make sure you're safe though first. Direct, you can say to the person, knock it off, but of course, also make sure you're safe. Delay, if you are delayed in a response, one thing that is so important to do is to ask that person if they're okay. That lessens that feeling of isolation and can really lend a helping hand when a person needs it. So thank you again for hosting this discussion. It is so important. Thank you most of all for standing up against dangerous xenophobia in our policies.
Thank you so much, Congresswoman. Thank you for sharing that information with us, and the fact of finding a positive way, a reasonable way of dealing with China is an issue that is very important to QI, and showing how that also interacts with the threat that Asian American feels if we walk into an unnecessary and counterproductive Cold War is tremendously important for us. So thank you for your leadership on this. Without any further ado, though, I want to give it over to Kaiser to introduce the panel and kickstart the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Trita. And thank you, Congresswoman Chu, for your trenchant remarks, for your excellent recommendations, both at a policy level and at a personal level. And most of all, thank you for your unwavering leadership of our community at this very crucial time. I am deeply honored to be part of this program, and I am very comforted in knowing that you are up there on the Hill fighting the good fight on our behalf. Now, the current xenophobia, while it has been exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic, has been, as we've said, long in the making. Xenophobia, I would call it the irrational, the emotional component of the current animus toward China that is so regrettably widespread throughout the American body politic at the moment, is both a manifestation of anti-Asian racism in America, and especially since the outbreak of the pandemic, also an accelerant of that racism. Today, we are going to be talking about the conspicuous ways in which, as Congresswoman Chu pointed out, anti-Asian racism is impacting civil liberties in the United States, about historical antecedents for this kind of racism that other ethnic groups in America have faced in times of crisis, but also about ways in which anti-Asian racism, which often grows out of putative national security concerns, recently over China most importantly, ironically, is actually working at cross currents with America's real national security interests. So with us to discuss these topics is a stellar panel. First up, we have Professor Gordon H. Chang, not that Gordon Chang, not the frequent Fox News commentator and the author of The Coming Collapse of China, published way back in 2001. Gordon H. Chang is professor of American history at Stanford University. He has written extensively about race and foreign relations and was recently a guest on the Sinica Podcast that I was a host of. Peter Beinart is a professor of journalism and political science at City University of New York and editor-at-large of Jewish Currents, which is co-hosting today's webinar. He is a frequent contributor to The Atlantic as well. And finally, Jessica Lee is a senior research fellow on East Asia at the Quincy Institute, the co-sponsor of this event. Her previous roles include community organizing for the Korean American community and serving as a foreign policy advisor in the House of Representatives. So a warm welcome to our fantastic panelists. Peter, let me start with you. There are parallels to historic anti-Semitism here that have not been lost, I think, on anyone with any interest in history. Probably most of us are familiar with the way that in the mid-1340s, as the Black Death spread across Europe, the idea that the Jews had somehow poisoned wells, resulting in many deaths, resulted in persecutions of Jews, in pogroms. As with Asian Americans, there was a stigma of foreignness that's always attached itself to the Jewish identity, suspicions about secret allegiances to other nations, especially since the creation of the State of Israel. Today, while anti-Semitism certainly persists, and while it's sometimes even dog whistled at or even more from political leaders, it would be unthinkable, I think, to encourage it actively, overtly, in the way that xenophobia and anti-Asian racism has been encouraged during the COVID-19 pandemic. What lessons can Asian Americans learn from Jewish Americans in combating bigotry and in organizing for a greater political voice?
Well, thanks very much for having me. One of the reasons that Jewish Currents was so honored to be a co-host of this is that we see the Jewish experience as creating a kind of an obligation on us, on Jews, to be particularly vigilant about other groups that might be marginalized and victimized because they're seen as strangers. Our tradition speaks very, very frequently about the obligation that Jews have to the stranger, the perceived stranger. You're absolutely right that there is a historical connection often of Jews with kind of as a biological threat, in the way that we sometimes see now in the kind of racist discussions about Chinese Americans or Chinese people and coronavirus. There's also this notion of kind of the idea that because Jews have transnational ties as a people, they aren't necessarily loyal to the countries in which they live. And I think it's also worth noting that Jews have suffered as a result of Cold Wars in the past. That I think one of the things that's really important in this current conversation as we get closer to a Cold War with China is not to be naive about the domestic consequences in American history for groups that have been associated with the enemy, whether it was German Americans who were brutalized during World War I, of course, Japanese Americans during the internment, but Jewish Americans, because Jewish Americans had been disproportionately represented in the 1930s on the American left in organizations that had affiliations sometimes with communism, suffered a great deal during the McCarthy attacks of the 1950s because of the idea that they were considered to be disloyal, that they represented a kind of a fifth column in the United States. It really put a chill on American Jewish life, and many people's lives were ruined as a result of that, just as we are now seeing that so many ethnically Chinese academics and researchers who were encouraged by their own institutions to form connections with Chinese institutions, just like it was acceptable at a certain point for Jews to be involved in activist left-wing organizations. When the geopolitics shifted, Jews got caught in the middle and some had their lives destroyed, and at the very least, they were sent the message that dissent on American policy was not acceptable. I think it's really, really important for us to fight against this wave of McCarthyism against Asian Americans, and to say that Asian Americans should feel every right to criticize American policy without fearing that they're going to be considered disloyal if they do.
Fantastic. Yeah, absolutely. Gordon, staying with this topic of biological threat, on top of the usual allegations about stealing American jobs, and you've written about this before, about a previous episode when health and hygiene were part of the prejudice, when Chinese were seen as some sort of a biological threat. Can you talk a little bit about that period? I think it was the late 19th century.
Thanks, Kaiser, and thank you for the host of this podcast. I'm honored to be here. As a historian, I like to think in historical terms about contemporary events, and certainly this current moment of what we might call xenophobia. I call it new xenophobia that's risen over this past months, even not after a few years. I think with the campaign of presidential campaign of Donald Trump. He resurrected or rekindled Sinophobia, which is now in full blossom. Early on in his campaign, he began to target China as a whole of countries' threat to the United States. But to go back to the 19th century, what concerns me about the current moment is that it taps into long-standing, deep historical experiences in the United States. In the 19th century, Chinese began to come in the 1850s, 1860s in some numbers, and they were greeted, they were welcomed, but also attacked as being different, foreign, unassimilable, and that there was what was called a cultural racism directed against them, not uncommon in those days in the mid-19th century. And in addition, there's something which historians call, in addition to cultural racism, that is the focus on language and behavior and food and so forth, there's also a biological racism. Peter Kaiser mentions this term biological threat. And Chinese were targeted as being also biologically, that is medically dangerous, genetically dangerous, because they were constituted differently, that Chinese genes were different. So this was not just a cultural difference, but a physical difference, a genetic difference, which would lead to greater disease, degradation of the general American population, and decline of the gene pool. So you'd see in the 19th century articles arguing that Chinese, for example, had a different gut, had a different digestive system, which made Chinese able to exist on rice and other foods. And food is such a big issue right now in the current moment, but even back then, that's suggesting that Chinese were not fully human as other people were, and therefore were genetically different, which also made them susceptible and also the source of diseases, smallpox, plague, other certain exotic, rare forms of venereal diseases, all of which were characteristic, they said, of Chinese. So Chinese became a biological threat. And that sense, I think, has been simmering below within American culture for a long period of time, and we can talk about that too. To jump up to the 20th century, we mentioned the Japanese American internment, and they were, as we know, targeted by the federal government and general society as being potential dangers to national internal security. Part of the argument was not just that they were by ancestry connected to the enemy, but also biologically inclined to be dangerous. And so the official government report that justified internment labeled Japanese Americans as an enemy race, that racially within their genes, they were inclined to be anti-American, not inclined, but were indelibly anti-American. So this is again, this sort of biological sense of that there was a irredeemable difference between Asians, Chinese in the 19th century, Japanese in the 20th century, and other populations in the United States. So this sense of biological difference, I should also say it came out, I use this pamphlet in my classes to illustrate this point. In 1906 or so, the famous labor leader, Samuel Gompers, issued a pamphlet with the incendiary title, Meat versus Rice, American Manhood versus Asiatic Coolieism, Which Shall Survive, question mark. And this captured very much the sense of clash of civilizations, meat versus clash of gendered identities, meat versus rice, American manhood versus Asiatic coolieism, and also a clash of races, of different races, which it was a part of social Darwin's belief at the time that there was a competition of races for virtual survival. And I think all these sort of currents, which are historical, I think we can see currents of this today, echoes of this in today's anti-Asian racism on many different levels that encourage that, yes, there was the campaign issues of Donald Trump, there was the trade wars, there's the accusations of intellectual theft and the targeting of Chinese ancestry scientists and so forth. And then there's this deep historical experience that has just been blossomed, which has been tapped into socially and by the general public, that I fear is going to be with us for a long time, even after the coronavirus issue is handled.
So we have this confluence of currents about biology, about culture or civilization, and underlying all of them is another current, and these are all sort of mutually reinforcing, of national security concerns. Jessica, you have written about the marginalization of Asian Americans. You've made the argument that I think that despite the ostensible concerns over national security, ironically, the anti-Asian racism has had a negative impact on security itself. Unpack that argument for us a little bit, which you made in Responsible Statecraft, the Quincy Institute's excellent online publication, about the importance of a diverse national security workforce and how it has been damaged in the past. I'm aware of a few important cases which illustrate this well.
Yes, thank you so much, Kaiser and Peter and Gordon. This has been such an enriching conversation already, and we're only 27 minutes in, so quite remarkable how much we're able to cover in such a short period of time. As Kaiser, you noted, I wanted to speak a little bit about the national security implication of the trends that Congresswoman Chu and others rightly pointed out, that's deeply rooted in history in this country. So the widespread use of the racialized term, like China virus, that's been endorsed within the highest levels of US government has really normalized associating the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, and the disease with Chinese people and indirectly all East Asian and Asian Americans, people who look like me. This was done despite clear warnings, as Congresswoman Chu said, from the scientific community. Both the World Health Organization and CDC had warned as early as 2015 that stigmatizing people or linking diseases with certain nationalities would be disastrous. But the focus of today's webinar isn't about the origins of the COVID virus. We should leave that to the scientists to figure out, but it's actually about the secondary order effects of using terms like China virus in our country. So what exactly does China virus rhetoric affect? How does it affect our national security? Number one, it undermines our ability to attract people with deep understanding of Asia to make informed policy decisions. So recruiting and retaining a government workforce with the right linguistic and cultural skills is an absolute national security imperative for us, especially given Asia's strategic importance right now. But anti-Asian bigotry, that is coming from, the top of the US government really risks driving away the Americans with the kinds of skills that US national security apparatus needs right now. The Foreign Service Institute categorizes Cantonese, Mandarin, Japanese, Korean, and Arabic as among the most difficult languages to learn, requiring 2,200 hours of State Department-sponsored language training, compared to only 600 hours of training that's required to master easier languages. So recruiting and retaining those with native fluency, including foreign-born immigrants, saves time and resources. And Asian Americans, perhaps more than other ethnic groups, have said that they have struggled to get assigned to countries where their language skills would be used due to fear of foreign influence. I'm talking about State Department Foreign Service officers. As an example, Con Nguyen, a US Foreign Service officer and a former vice president of the Asian American Foreign Affairs Association, recently wrote an article in Civil Beat that in which he said, quote, "Questions of loyalty and patriotism have a disproportionate impact on US government officials of Asian descent." So the second thing to remember is a linguistically and culturally fluent workforce actually makes for better policy. I mean, that's really, I think, central. And so to understand this point, we really need look back just less than 20 years ago, look at what happened in Iraq and Afghanistan, right? The absence of a diverse national security workforce probably contributed to miscalculations and blind spots and misperceptions about the kinds of reception we would receive once we went there. So for example, once the Iraq war started, the lack of expertise on the linguistic side was very clear, and it actually was very costly on us. So as CIA Station Chief Haviland Smith had noted at the time, the US intelligence community prior to 9/11 had suffered from a shortage of Arabic speakers and staff in country to help maintain relations with local liaisons that are crucial for the agency's mission. And even as the war went on, the shortage continued. So for example, in 2007, a study found that only 33 people spoke Arabic among the 1,000 people who worked in the US Embassy in Iraq. So I want to now turn to another aspect of this, which is that, as Congresswoman Chu and others have raised, the anti-Asian racism is being weaponized to gin up anti-China sentiments that will promote an anti-China foreign policy. And this is a big problem.
Absolutely.
Racist attitudes toward Asians, really prevent the United States from crafting effective and nuanced policies toward China and Asia, while exaggerating the threat from China with inflammatory language. While exaggerating the threat from China with inflammatory language actually feeds into the racism that we're seeing right now. So I think there's a lot of different components of this that I want to unpack further in the discussion, but I'll turn back over to you, Kaiser.
Yeah, you've raised a couple of interesting things that touch on questions that I really wanted to put. I wanted to turn to Peter in just a second about Islamophobia and about the parallels there, the experience of Arab, Persian, and Turkish Americans, especially in the United States. But first, you brought up something about, it's not just people who work in the intelligence community or in the Department of Defense who are responsible for American national security. American national security, more broadly interpreted, has a lot to do with American scientific and technological prowess as well. And anyone who knows anything about Silicon Valley knows how first of all, how crucial it is to American technological primacy, but also how heavily staffed it is with people of East Asian and South Asian descent. So Gordon, not long ago, we had a conversation about this very topic. And I wanted to get your thoughts on what this is doing, not just COVID-19, but the anti-Asian racism that was prevalent even before that, especially the xenophobia that was prevalent before that. Has it had a major chilling effect? And then specifically with COVID, a lot of people are not able to get to travel from China. I think enrollments in major universities, which had reached 350,000 annually prior to this, will be significantly down come fall. I mean, it's already declining significantly. How does this impact American national security?
Thanks, Kaiser. I'll start off talking about my perceptions of the impact on the Silicon Valley culture. Coincidentally, I was on another webinar yesterday morning with, I think it was a couple of hundred Stanford graduate business school alums. Mm-hmm. and folks connected to the Stanford Business School, many of them in Silicon Valley, but all around the world. And the discussion was very similar to what we're having right now, of what was the consequence of anti-Asian, anti-Chinese sentiment, but focused on business. Now, this group, many of them had signed a letter that decried the prejudice and declared their support for rights and fair play and opposition to this unwarranted suspicion. As business people, they wrote this inspired in part by self-interest that their companies are being affected by this climate. That is what Jessica and others have said. You've said that so many of the Silicon Valley companies, from the lowest level to the highest levels, are staffed with people of Asian ancestry. I think most people don't know this around the country, but Silicon Valley is heavily Asian American, from the entrepreneurs, the venture capitalists, to the line operators, to the assembly people, to the salespeople, to the managers, all along the line. And Silicon Valley would not be what it is today without the tremendous influx of Asians in the past 40 years. Now, this group was very, very concerned about the rising climate of suspicion and hate on their own business interests, but also ethically, that they said they wanted to stand up to oppose this kind of sentiment for what it is, which was hateful, prejudiced, immoral. And we're very concerned that this would get out of hand and affect their business interests, American national interests, business generally, and American society. Now, just to give you a small example of what's going on in Silicon Valley, let me draw on just some personal experiences here at Stanford. I've had Stanford Asian American students, not just Chinese, but students of Asian ancestry from Vietnam, Korea, and others. And they've told me often, and just as an aside, is, oh, by the way, I was downtown Palo Alto, And this person accosted me and started yelling at me about getting out of town and wanted to know if I was connected to that Chang University up the road. And she didn't even report this to me until it came out several weeks later in some type of message. Oh, by the way, this happened to me a couple of weeks, right after we had our meeting. Other students were biking around. This is before the shelter in place. They were biking in a park, and it was part of the growing anti-Chinese sentiment. And some people, a couple of women, came up to them and started yelling at them and even accosted them, knocked one of the students off their bike and said, "Get out of town." This is in a liberal town.
Right.
Now, just last week, my wife, who's Euro-American, and I were walking around getting some fresh air in a Stanford neighborhood. This Stanford neighborhood. Stanford has lots of housing for faculty. We live here, and this neighborhood is full of faculty, current and retired. And we passed by this older couple and let them, out of respect, pass by. They were walking on, getting some air. And as they passed us, the woman stopped and turned and looked right at me in my Stanford cap and my Nike clothes and said, "Did you just arrive?" And I don't know who they were. I didn't know. This was out of the blue. I didn't know what she meant. I said, "Excuse me, I don't know what you mean. What are you asking?" She says, Did you just arrive? I still went like this. "I don't know what you mean." She said, "Did you just arrive from China?" And I'm not a tongue-tied person usually, but I was speechless.
Right.
This is kind of a silly, stupid comment. It's nothing like the acid throwing, knife welding incidents we've heard about. But it is indicative, I think, of the social ignorance, stupidity, suspicion that just is permeating the atmosphere, even in well-heeled and liberal and educated places, right like on the Stanford campus.
Well, fortunately, we've had some non-silly, non-stupid comments in the Q&A thread already. Some of them sort of are more comments than questions, but one that I want to raise and put to Jessica before I go to Peter with the Islamic question is from Deborah Seligson, who asks, she's, and this is something that I've experienced myself, the people who have even studied, American students, Anglo-American students who have studied in China for extended periods, are being dissuaded now from even applying to jobs in the intelligence community. This is a real danger, I imagine. What can be done about this? I mean, I know that people have told me after having lived in China for 20 years, don't even bother. You will not get clearance. There's just no way that you could possibly get clearance. Some of the people who know China the best, I think, who have spent years there. What do we do about this, Jessica?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's something that I actually recently discussed with a colleague who works in the Senate and who has a child learning Mandarin. He wanted to send his child to China so that he can study the language full time, get immersed, and then ultimately decided that was not going to be a good idea because he wanted to, his child wanted to eventually work in government. So I think there is this perception, whether it's real and true or not, that going to China for an extended period of time, learning the language, really understanding how they view the world and themselves is going to hurt your prospect of joining U.S. government, particularly the intelligence agency. And that's just dumb. I mean, that's ridiculous. But that, I think, is in fact the perception that is quite pervasive, and it results in a climate where people feel like they have to hunker down and just play it safe and be here. Right. When really the foreign policy and diplomacy is all about how well you can assess the other side. And the only way you can do that is through talking and building relations and seeing for yourself United States from outside the country.
Well, as we said, there are parallels to the American experience during the so-called global war on terror after September 11th. Islamophobia was rampant. We saw turbaned Sikhs, actually, who were not, by the way, Muslim, gunned down after both September 11th and after San Bernardino. This country doesn't have a particularly good record of being able to distinguish. But turning to the experience of people from the Islamic world or with roots in the Islamic world, one thing that I have seen is there's been quite a bit of solidarity. After in January and February of 2017, after President Trump announced the travel ban, the so-called Muslim ban, which is in fact what it was. There were spontaneous sit-ins at demonstrations at airports involving many lawyers, activists who showed up all over airports all over the country. how do we create awareness around racial attacks against East Asian Americans? Peter?
That's a really good question. I think one of the things that worries me a lot is that I think we have an industry that has been created since 9/11 in particular, that is essentially geared towards the idea that you can't be a practicing Muslim and a loyal American. And as American foreign policy shifts potentially, we see that industry shifting as well towards essentially making a parallel set of arguments. Again, arguments that also have deep roots in Asian American history about with people who said that Chinese or Japanese Americans in the first part of the 20th century could not be fully Americans because they were somehow racially loyal to another civilization or another separate people. And so, for instance, you see someone like Frank Gaffney, is kind of like one of the most, I think, notorious peddlers of anti-Muslim sentiment in Washington over the recent decades. Recently has literally repeatedly argued that Islam does not a religion and Muslims do not deserve protections of freedom of speech and religion in the United States. Now, recently leading this newly created committee on the present danger to focus on China. And if you look at the rhetoric on its website, you see a lot of discussion about the danger that the Chinese diaspora communities are being kind of weaponized by China and therefore represent a threat. So I really worry that we will see in large swaths of the Republican Party a kind of a turn from the demonization of Muslims as a political strategy towards Asian Americans. And you're right that people have fought back over the last 20 years, and there have been alliances that have been created. And I think that's exactly what we're going to need to do now, which is to aggressively challenge the notion that so often criticisms of China are couched in liberal language as concerns for human rights. And of course, there are enormous human rights concerns that one should be concerned about vis-a-vis the government of China. But I think what we have to continually demand of people who are speaking in Cold War terms about China is that they spend at least as much attention on the human rights concerns for the United States of what a Cold War with China could mean. And often, and so far, I think, even among more respectable Republicans who are peddling this Cold War rhetoric, I think you see not nearly enough concern about that.
Absolutely. Dr. Leonard Vinnick asks the question, is this discrimination not part of a long-standing history of the racist white society that has not been significantly addressed and has been accentuated by Trump and Miller? He's talking about Stephen Miller in the Trump administration. I think one of the really difficult things is to parse the role of racism in the American response to China's rise in the first place. So I want to put this question maybe first to Gordon. What is your sense of this? An incumbent power like the United States, 75 years of really unchallenged primacy in the world, now faces this multidimensional peer competitor, and unsurprisingly, this is psychologically difficult. How much more so when that peer competitor is non-white? Remember, not so very long ago, then Director of Policy and Planning at the State Department, Karen Skinner, made these remarks in a New America session where she talked about America being challenged for the first time by a non-Caucasian competitor. And a lot of people raked her over the coals over this remark, saying this was evoking Huntington, that this was actually factually incorrect, that in fact, China has faced, the United States has faced Japan, which is non-Caucasian in the past. But I've come to wonder whether she was actually asking a different question and putting her finger on something that's really profound, which is really the role of racism in the current anxiety about China. This is a big topic, but put your hand up if there's something that you would like to say about this. But let's start with Gordon.
Yeah, to expand a bit on that comment, that the United States was now facing for the first time a competitor who was non-white or non-Western. She was actually making a comparison, I believe, with the Soviet Union, that China, that as bad as the Cold War with the Soviet Union, at least it was a white/Western country. And the threat now, alleged threat from China, is different because it's a civilizational, racial difference as well as a geopolitical one. So it's elevated to a much uglier level. I've did a lot of study of Cold War relations in the 50s and 60s. My first book was on looking at the relationship of the United States to the Soviet Union and China. And what struck me in doing that research was how often Western U.S. leaders would say things such as, well, in thinking about the Soviet Union and China, they said, dealing with the Soviet Union, at least we're dealing with a Western country that has certain Western norms of behavior and what right or wrong is and these type of things and racial behavior. And so what she said, what you quoted, is taps right into a long-standing attitude. Now, let me say one of the problems, dangers, and Jessica's mentioned this too, about the threat to American interests. When one exaggerates the danger, one can have the counter effect. It can be counterproductive. That is to say, and we've already begun to see this, the United States is losing talent, including from Silicon Valley, which I mentioned before, but also from universities of Chinese ancestry, researchers, scientists, engineers, specialist personnel, who are thinking that the climate in the United States is too hostile for them and their families, and they're going to go elsewhere for their lives and careers. And so there's a reverse sort of brain drain now from the United States as people see their futures better suited in Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Europe, and China and Asia. At Stanford University, the number of applications to go to Stanford graduate school, which had cultivated a relationship with East Asian countries, that the number of applications of the top tier students has dropped like 50% in the past year to come to Stanford. And that's the reverse of what people actually wanted for, if you will, a national security interest. We want to bring the best talent from around the world here. And now we're sort of driving them away. And this echoes something happened during the late 40s and 1950s when there was a rise in McCarthyism, and Peter's talked about this, targeting different groups. Chinese American scientists were also targeted at the time and drove a number of them out of the country because of alleged sympathies with liberalism or socialism or communism, or some just suspicion because of their racial background, or ethnic background. Some of these scientists went back to China and became the leading scientists in China that helped create China's rocket program and nuclear weapons program. And they were all trained as engineers and physicists and chemists in the United States. But that's sort of the boomerang effect that can happen when you have this climate of hostility.
We were talking about Chen Xuesen, the MIT trained, Caltech trained rocket scientist. Jessica, are we in danger right now of creating more Chen Xuesens?
Well, I mean, I think, I just want to kind of build on what Gordon just said. I mean, I think there is, among many other kind of short-term and long-term impact of what we're seeing right now from a national security perspective. I mean, you have to ask yourself, if you're a US diplomat of Asian descent and you're getting tasked to go overseas, what will that feel like after COVID? How will those people perceive you, in those countries? I mean, can you credibly promote values like mutual respect and tolerance when your own government is singling you out and people who look like you out as somehow connected to the pandemic? So I think racism has an impact on our soft power and global image in ways that will take years to repair. And then just going back to an earlier point I made about retention, if Asian American diplomats feel underutilized and overlooked for roles where their skills can further diplomacy because of their ethnicity and the color of their skin, some may choose not to join government, as we already discussed, and others might just want not to be associated with US government or anything public service oriented, period. And that's a big loss, as Gordon just pointed out. We don't want smart, talented people to forego government because of this climate. And so I think these are the types of things, I mean, we don't have enough data yet to know if Asian Americans are definitely being targeted or unfairly scrutinized due to racism in the security clearance process or assignment process when they're posted overseas. But these are the types of questions policymakers should be asking.
Absolutely. Peter, both of us have talked about our concerns about the Biden campaign, how it looks like it's going to continue to make China an issue in the campaign, that it might try to actually outflank Trump and paint him as actually having trusted China, having been insufficiently tough on China, actually sending PPE, for example, to China when we had a need for it here in the United States. There have been two, I think, ads from the campaign and one from a super PAC that have been pretty hardcore China bash. Well, the super PAC one especially. What concerns you about this?
It concerns me a lot. I mean, I think that there's a political calculation that I think people on the Biden political side of the campaign are making, that that this is a potential weakness for them, and they can kind of nip it in the bud by actually getting to Trump's right on China, by saying he's the one who's soft on China. And, you know, this is an old-fashioned kind of democratic anxiety about needing to show that you're as tough as the Republicans on everything. I think, first of all, it's out of date in terms of the politics. I think it's alienating to some core Democratic voters, but I also think it's very dangerous for a Biden presidency, that essentially he is feeding into this template rather than challenging it. He is legitimizing the notion of a Cold War perspective, and I think it will dog him, if he's lucky to become president, in the way it's dogged previous Democratic presidents. You know, the Democratic presidents of the 1960s, for instance, always looking over, Johnson and Kennedy, always looking over their shoulder to be, are they tough enough in the Cold War? This is, I think, going to lead to bad policymaking. It's going to make it harder for Biden to reverse these elements of Trump's policy, this kind of American kind of Brexit we're seeing with the decoupling from China, with the terrible consequences that Gordon and Jessica have talked about. And I really think that Biden needs to have the self-confidence to actually challenge the whole template. It also makes it much harder for him to talk about reinvesting in the World Health Organization if you're buying into this Cold War narrative, right? Because it's connected to Trump's effort at delegitimizing international cooperation. So I really worry that this is the wrong tack for the Biden and the Democrats to take.
A question for all of you. I think the Quincy Institute is certainly not alone in placing at the very top of global priorities climate change and the kinds of global pandemics that we're seeing at this very moment. These are top issues that the United States and China ought to tackle together. I think any reasonable person would agree. And yet we're certainly not seeing that. What are some of the steps that need to be taken for the two countries to actually begin to rebuild trust? Can cooperation, for example, at a subnational level, what we're seeing between California, for example, or even among groups of concerned citizens, of non-governmental organizations, the third sector, is there anything meaningful that we can be doing? And then a related question to this, and this comes from the audience, Tanya Sims asks, what can we be doing as AAPI people here in the United States to get more action on this from the community, so to hold our leaders more accountable to our groups? Two related but different questions. But let's start with the big U.S.-China picture and cooperation on global pandemics and climate change, these urgent questions.
Yeah, Kaiser, I can start off. I mean, those are very big questions. We will need another hour to really do justice, but I think you're asking all the right questions there. I think on bilateral cooperation, I mean, part of what we're seeing that's so problematic right now is that certain members of Congress and politicians are using, as I said, this very anger, resentful feeling that American people are having about COVID and its, a potential origin from China as a way to say, hey, let's go after China. Like, this is our time, this is our moment, let's do it. And, that's, as we all recognize, incredibly dangerous and short-sighted for so many reasons, right? So, I mean, I think to kind of look at it from a different perspective, those elected officials who use those language really ought to be called out. I mean, there's no other way, because they are getting taxpayer money to be in those positions representing their people and their states and their districts. If they have unfettered, just kind of no resistance or criticism about what the things they say, however irresponsible or reprehensible, then they feel like they're empowered and emboldened to continue that message. And that's where I think particularly Asian Americans, to your second question, really need to be unequivocal. And then I think just one other thing I wanted to add is, we had talked about, other ways that, we can build kind of solidarity and more coalition so that Asian Americans don't feel so alone. And I think that's such an important point, Kaiser, you've made repeatedly, which I'm really grateful for. One particular initiative that I wanted to highlight that I thought was really helpful was there's a group of about 200 national security professionals who recently signed a pledge that's published on USA Today that calls for national security and foreign policy experts to condemn racism and xenophobia against Asian Americans. And that was astounding to me because it was signed most of the people on that were non-Asian Americans. But they felt like this was an important enough issue to be out there and to put their name out. And so that's, I think, a way in which we start to build a greater sense of like, this is not part of who we are as a country. We can do better.
Jessica, you are Korean American yourself, and your community, your experience of racism in the wake of COVID-19 might be described as collateral damage. Not that a racist is who's about to hurl an epithet or a stone or a fist is going to stop and ask about your ethnic identity. But when Chinese Americans, especially people like me or maybe like Gordon, when we are involved in the discourse already on U.S.-China relations or on Chinese politics, and when we get critical about anti-Asian racism, we're often accused of carrying water for the Chinese Communist Party, for sort of pushing its own propaganda line. I've actually been accused of this directly by the other Gordon Chang, just for calling out Trump's use of the phrase Chinese virus. Perhaps our Gordon Chang has experienced the same thing. Are people of other non-Chinese origins, you mentioned this letter and you highlighted the fact that most of the people were not AAPIs, but within this community of AAPI people, I almost feel like Korean Americans, Japanese Americans, Vietnamese Americans, Filipino Americans are almost better placed to call this out than Chinese are.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's something to that. I completely know what you mean by the fact that you happen to be, ethnically Chinese, that you are now put in a different standard. I, face that same challenge when I comment on Korea-related issues all the time. So, I think that is a burden that we carry, but I just want to kind of go back to what I said. I mean, we've seen other high profile kind of instances like Huma Abedin, where, then Senator John McCain came out and said, look, the fact that you're accusing her of somehow being associated with, Muslim Brotherhood is outrageous, and I'm going to stand by her. And then we had a more recent instance of an Iranian American State Department official, Sahar Nourizadeh, who unfortunately didn't have that kind of validator by her side at the State Department when she was, accused of when she came under political scrutiny unfairly. So, I guess, all to say, this is, I think, a challenge that many of us from all kinds of, minority groups face. That's part of what makes the job of being a minority in the U.S. government so challenging because people don't really know if you're fully American or just 50%, and that's just deeply unfair. And I think it goes to.
I really wish, we had more time for this, and especially to maybe talk about what a lot of people in the question queue have been asking, more specific policy recommendations on how to move forward on this. But I want to thank the organizers, the Quincy Institute and Jewish Currents, for convening this very important discussion and for inviting me to moderate. I hope that you'll continue to support the important work that they are doing. Let me thank again Congresswoman Judy Chu, as well as our three panelists, Jessica Lee, Gordon Chang, and Peter Beinart, as well as Srita Parsi for introducing us here. Srita, over to you.
Thank you so much, Kaiser. Thank you for a fantastic conversation. I think it was a stark reminder that most of the damage that is inflicted these days in international relations tend to be self-inflicted. And here we have a really clear case in which, particularly if we believe that China and Asia is a very pivotal strategic area, that the stigmatization of Asian American is not just morally wrong, but is utterly counterproductive. So thank you so much for this excellent conversation and for highlighting this. I wanted to lead off by just mentioning a couple of the panels that are coming up that Quincy is organizing. tomorrow, we will be co-hosting a discussion together with Foreign Policy for America on the essential role of dissent in government. Speakers include QI's own Lizzie Shackelford and Ambassador Nancy McEldowney. Next week, we will have two panels on Wednesday, the 27th, one on rethinking the US-Saudi relationship with Aaron David Miller, as well as Greg Goss and Madawi Al-Rashid. And on later that same day, we will have a panel co-organized with the East Asia Foundation in South Korea on the South Korean parliamentary elections and the impact on South Korea-US relations. And that panel will include Congressman Ami Bera, as well as Dr. Moon Jung-in, who is a special advisor to South Korean President Moon Jae-in. So if you haven't already, please go to quincyinst.org and sign up for our newsletter so you get notifications about all of these panels and events that we have. Once you have done that, I look forward to seeing you tomorrow. Thank you so much.
Thank you.